The messengers of the dream, as we saw in part 1 of this two-part episode, are the psychopomps of Bloodborne, entities that guide spirits between the lands of the living and the land of the dead. We see this dynamic play out as the messengers usher our spirit between the dreaming and waking worlds, appearing at the base of the lamps and the headstones of awakening within the hunter's dream. Although we made several breakthroughs about the messengers in part 1, many important questions remain unanswered, beginning with this one. Why lamps? Why did From Software choose lamps to be part of the travel mechanic instead of any other object or environmental feature? Based on what we've established about the messengers, we can put forth a sound explanation for the meaning of the lamps. But more importantly, the observations we make about the lamps allow us to make a much larger conclusion about the metaphysics of the game. We also saw in part 1 that the messengers are the spirits of dead children, or more specifically, of children who died before, during, or very shortly after birth. It's this essential detail that allows us to explain why the Brain of Mensis is composed of hundreds of messengers, and to some extent, why they make up the heads of the Winter Lantern enemies of the nightmare. But why is the hunter's dream home to the spirits of dead children? Perhaps it's because the dream and the nightmare aren't as different as they seem. As I detailed in part 1 of this episode, the messengers appear intertwined with the mythos of the Roman god Mercury, or his Greek counterpart Hermes. Hermes was the god of messages, commerce, and boundaries who guided souls of the dead to the underworld. As we saw in part 1, the messengers quite similarly convey messages, are responsible for commerce, and shuttle the soul or essence of the player character between worlds. Interestingly enough, one of Hermes' daughters was named Angelia and was considered the personification of messages. Her name is derived from the word angelos, the Greek word for messenger, which is where we get the English word angel, as viewer Jorge Meneses astutely pointed out. We see the same association between messages and angels in Japanese folklore. The Japanese word for angel is tenshi, which can be translated as heavenly messenger. All of this suggests that the messengers might very well have been designed to be the angels of Bloodborne, something that will seem more and more plausible as we proceed. This revelation that the messengers are spirits of dead children who perform the duty of an angelic psychopomp greatly assists us in our evaluation of the lamps. In terms of explaining their presence in the game, it helps to work our way to the lamps starting in the hunter's dream. As we know, if we want to access any lamp in the game, we do so by using the so-called headstones of awakening. We therefore arrive at the lamps by first interacting with a stone that would mark a grave. We're also shown that we use these headstones of awakening to awaken above ground, suggesting that when we're in the hunter's dream, we're figuratively underground, as if we're dead and buried. More accurately, it seems that we exist only in spirit when we're in the hunter's dream, as if our physical body is dead and buried, and we exist in corporeal form when we return to the waking or living world. Thus, by using the headstones and then awakening at the lamps, we return to life as if we're emerging from the grave. If lamps are the places at which our character returns to life, it would only seem to follow that these are where our character's spirit returns. It's where the angelic messengers guide our soul. That's why the messengers can always be found at the base of the lamps. The question, of course, is why lamps of all things? For that answer, we can turn to a real-life sacred ceremony that has long been the subject of inquiry within the Bloodborne lore community. The Bon or Obon Festival, also known as the Festival of Lanterns, is an annual celebration in Japanese Buddhism to honor the spirits of the dead. Unsurprisingly, it's commonly referred to as the Festival of the Dead. The primary purpose of the festival is to bring happiness to the spirits of deceased ancestors, in turn bringing joy and good fortune to those who make offerings to the spirits. This process requires that spirits be beckoned from the afterlife and welcomed back to the living world. What guides these spirits? Lanterns. Asian studies scholar Ensho Ashikaga documented the rituals of the Bon Festival in a highly detailed 1950 article, writing, "On the 13th day, lanterns are lighted throughout the cemeteries, and in some districts, the mukaibi, or welcome fire, is set before the house to light the way homeward for the guests from the other world." Just like lanterns guide the spirits of the dead back to the living world as part of the Bon Festival, in Bloodborne, we find ourselves in this otherworldly land known as the Hunter's Dream, where we reach out to a gravestone and then suddenly emerge back in the waking or living world at a lamp. The lamps we find in Bloodborne, of course, don't look anything like the paper lanterns of the Bon Festival. That's not really surprising given the Victorian Gothic aesthetic of the game. But there's one other feature of the lamp design that stands out and can't be dismissed as irrelevant, because it correlates with everything we know and have already discussed about the lamps as a place of resurrection or returning from the grave. The lamps hang from a curved metal spike, and are situated beneath something that seems completely out of place. A set of bells. Why bells? Bells appear in numerous places throughout the game, but there's a common aspect that seems to connect them all, which we touched on briefly in my video, What Really Happened to Lawrence. In Bloodborne, bells somehow are associated with the transfer of beings between worlds. We see this play out in myriad ways. According to their item descriptions, the ringing sound of both the beckoning bell and the small resonant bell, quote, resonates across worlds and allows other hunters to cross the gap, an unseen boundary between planes of existence. In similar fashion, the sinister resonant bell is one of the resonating bells that cross the gaps of worlds. In online mode, ringing the beckoning bell calls forth a bell-ringing woman or chime maiden. And as we well know, chime maidens ring their bells and bring dead enemies back to life, as if they're pulling them back into the waking or living world. They also ring their bells and bring forth the one reborn from another dimension. Finally, there's one item that seems to confirm the significance and purpose of Bloodborne's bells. The choir bell, unlike other bells, doesn't bring anyone back from the dead or convey anyone across planes of existence. It's simply a healing item. That's why the bell's description says, "The sound of this smaller silver version of the bell does not cross planes. The sound doesn't resonate into other dimensions, and therefore no one is transported between worlds as with all other bells." Because bells are associated with interplanar transit, and because we've established that the waking and dreaming worlds are parallels for the lands of the living and the dead, we can view bells, to a large extent, as associated with resurrection. Perhaps that's also why we hear a bell ringing every time Brador invades us, as if he's returning to life again and again to keep us from reaching the Orphan of Kos. With that in mind, let's return to the lamps and their set of bells. Obviously, the lamps are where we respawn after we die. They're where we return to the waking world anytime we come back from the dream. The lamps are therefore our resurrection points. And if the lamp feature is indeed inspired by the Bon Festival lanterns that guide the soul of the dead back to the living world, then it seems very likely that the bells on the lamps are much like the other bells of the game that aid in interdimensional travel. But again, why bells? There's a real-life source of inspiration from the Victorian era that appears to be in play. In the 1800s, mainly in the United States and Great Britain, a sense of panic entered the zeitgeist that persisted for several decades. This fear is known formally as taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. The concern had one foot in reality and one in irrationality. In the 19th century, and even before, there had been few but nonetheless horrifying cases in which people had been mistakenly deemed dead and then buried alive, or had been deemed dead only to awaken on the dissection table of a surgeon's anatomy room. Edgar Allan Poe famously capitalized on this frightening subject in several works, most notably his 1844 short horror story titled The Premature Burial, in which the main character suffers from a crippling and ever-present fear of being buried alive. To address the public's fear of vivisepulture, inventive capitalists responded with unique adaptations to the common casket, developing what were known as safety coffins. These enhanced receptacles came equipped with pipes or even fans that would deliver fresh air to the coffin while underground. But air could only help keep a person alive. It couldn't get them out of their subterranean prison. For that, safety coffins needed to be outfitted with a signal to the above-ground world that a living person had been buried by mistake. Thus, they came with what was commonly called a grave bell. Safety coffins that were patented in the United States between the 1860s and the 1920s almost always included a bell or alarm that a person could trigger from inside the grave to signal to a gravekeeper or to passers-by that someone had been buried alive. Although the first generation of safety coffins came equipped with a cord the person could pull to sound the alarm, an 1871 patent for a life detector for coffins was granted to Theodore Schrader and Hermann West and featured a chain placed in the hand of the corpse, which, if pulled, would ring a bell and release a latch, causing a door to fall open, admitting air to the coffin and serving as a signal flag. If we take a look at the lamps in Bloodborne, we obviously see 3 bells atop the metal frame that's stuck in the ground, which is somewhat similar to the hooked spike upon which a grave bell could be hung. But on closer inspection, we see that there's something else here. A chain. Although it's loosely wrapped around the lamp itself, the chain is attached to the bells and dangles below the lamp. I feel confident saying that the bells, attached to the lamp and connected to a chain, are a reference to the safety coffin devices of the 19th century. Just like someone could pull a safety coffin chain to ring a bell, and then very literally be removed from the grave and pulled above ground, the lamps of Bloodborne, these places where we awaken above ground, come equipped with bells on a chain. The point is this: although the messengers, headstones, and lamps are part of Bloodborne's travel mechanic, to view the lamps as simply a means of transit is to miss the point. We're not just traveling from point A to point B. Instead, every time we travel from the dream to any lamp in the waking world, we're quite literally making a spiritual journey between the underworld and the living world. No discussion of the messengers would be complete without an examination of the winter lanterns, one of the most frightening and challenging enemies in the game that can be found only within the nightmare regions. Regions that we can consider, for all intents and purposes, a hellish underworld. There's a glut of content about the meaning and lore of the winter lanterns, and much of what we'll cover at first is well-worn territory. When I said earlier in this video that the Bon Festival had been the subject of intense scrutiny within the Bloodborne lore community, we can credit the winter lanterns for that. That's because the Japanese name for the winter lanterns is hozuki, which is a type of flower more commonly known as a Chinese lantern or Japanese lantern that, thanks to the unique texture of its husk, resembles a paper lantern. Hozuki flowers are a special ornamentation used during several summer festivals, including the Bon Festival, where it's primarily a decorative item that, like the paper lanterns of the festival, act as a welcoming sign to the spirits of the dead. In fact, the Japanese kanji for hozuki can be broken down to literally mean demon light or ghost lamp. The concept of hozuki being lantern-like flowers that welcome the dead is crucial to keep in mind as we evaluate the winter lanterns and the Brain of Mensis. To start though, we need to ask ourselves, what do the Brain of Mensis and the winter lanterns have in common? First, let's talk about what's already known. We know that the Brain of Mensis and the heads of the winter lanterns are composed of dead, or what I prefer to call inanimate messengers. We also know that both enemies have unusual appendages that look like fleshy tendrils. And we know that both enemies inflict frenzy on the player character. While this is all accurate, there's a more basic shared feature that's gone largely overlooked. The Brain of Mensis and the Winter Lanterns do something very unique. They emit light. Why does that matter? Well, for one, they're called winter lanterns, and what does a lantern do? It emits light. And because they're named hozuki, after the lantern-like flowers that are used during the Bon Festival to help summon the spirits of the dead, it's a safe assumption that the winter lanterns, or hozuki, have a similar purpose or meaning in the game. one that might be applicable to the Brain of Mensis as well. They attract spirits of the dead. A theory that's captured my interest for a long time is that the Brain of Mensis was formed by the consciousness or spirits of the Mensis scholars, as if they were sucked into the nightmare and formed into this massive brain. It is the Brain of Mensis, after all, which is found in the Nightmare of Mensis. For a detailed breakdown of this theory, I'd refer you to Smotown's recent video on the Great Ones, which I've linked below. For a long time, I couldn't fully embrace this theory, mainly because I'd understood the messengers to be spirits of dead children. If the Brain of Mensis is composed of spirits of dead children, then how can it be composed of the spirits or minds of the Mensis scholars? Eventually, I realized that these aren't mutually exclusive, and I had been overlooking a simple but essential detail, ironically one that I've highlighted again and again in my videos. I argued in the latter episodes of my Agony of Effort series that the ritual of Mensis essentially was the dissection of the dead body of Queen Yharnam and her unborn child Murgo. It was, and still is, my belief that the Brain of Mensis is, to a large extent, a representation of the discovery of a literal brain inside the dead, rotting body of Yharnam or her child during an anatomical dissection. Much of what we learn about the Brain of Mensis comes from the living string item, which helps to support this metaphor. It describes a rotten, eroded brain like that of a corpse. But it's the 1/3 of umbilical cord we obtain after defeating Murgo's wet nurse that provides us with the missing puzzle piece that might very well confirm the theory about the Mensis scholars becoming the Brain of Mensis. It states, this cord granted Mensis audience with Murgo, but resulted in the stillbirth of their brains. Let's piece it all together and explain exactly why the Brain of Mensis is composed of messengers. In this 2-part episode, we've firmly established several critical details. The messengers are spirits of children, but not just any children. They're children who died either in the womb, during childbirth, or shortly thereafter. The messengers are also closely connected with the lamps, as if they're drawn to the lamps, these light-emitting devices that serve as our spiritual guideposts where our soul returns to our body in the waking or living world. That's why the messengers can be seen staring directly into the light of the lamps. They can't help but follow these lights. In the process of dissecting the corpse of Queen Yharnam and retrieving the cord from her unborn child Murgo, the Mensis scholars somehow died, the specifics of which aren't fully known. Their dead bodies were left to mummify within their anatomy theater near Advent Plaza in Yahar'gul. But their minds, as the cord tells us, were stillborn. Hence, their minds or spirits were altered. They became those of stillborn children. They became messengers. The scholars' collective stillborn spirits became the Brain of Mensis, a unified, infantile consciousness. It shines brightly and resembles the winter lanterns in order to tell us that these spirits of the Mensis scholars coalesced into this brain as if they were following the light of a lantern. So, while I think Smotown and others who have advanced this theory are absolutely correct that the Brain of Mensis is the combined minds of Mensis, I think this extra layer or two of nuance helps to firm up their conclusion and explain exactly why and how it happened. What about the winter lanterns? Why are they composed of messengers? That's a tougher question, and it's one that I have to admit I can't answer. We can make some progress, though. It's been well documented that the winter lanterns are wearing the same clothing as the plain doll of the Hunter's Dream, and the doll and the lanterns have the same segmented fingers. The lanterns also hum or sing a disturbing song or lullaby, giving them the aura of a nightmarish mother figure. The doll, by contrast, comes across as a benevolent motherly figure. She has a calm, soothing voice. She prays for our well-being. She channels blood echoes to strengthen us. And she gently cradles our alien body in the game's secret ending called Childhood's Beginnings. If the doll of the dream is a benevolent figure who exists in a realm with animated messengers, these angelic spirits of dead children, the winter lanterns, with their heads composed of inanimate messengers, are essentially a monstrous inverse of the doll. In fact, the internal file name of the Winter Lanterns is Failure to Become Messengers. If my earlier thoughts about Hozuki were correct and the kanji can indeed literally mean ghost lamp or demon light, then this makes even more sense. The messengers are angels. The Winter Lanterns are failed angels. They're demons. They are quite literally demon lamps. That would explain why we find them in these hellish landscapes of the Nightmare Realm. Interestingly, the internal file name for Murgo's wet nurse, which we also encounter in the Nightmare of Mensis, is succubus, a type of female demon. A common Japanese translation of succubus is muma, meaning a demon that appears in nightmares. That seems pretty appropriate here. But it's worth noting that succubi have been generally described in Western and Middle Eastern folklore as incapable of reproduction. Thus, they seduce men and take their seed, giving it to male demons called incubi, who use it to impregnate human females who act as surrogates. That should sound familiar to all of us who are even remotely familiar with the lore of the Great Ones. It would make sense within Bloodborne's lore that Murgo's wet nurse represents a succubus, who used Queen Yharnam as a sort of surrogate mother and then stole her unborn child in the nightmare. That might also mean that Yharnam's child Murgo is, or represents, what's called a cambion, a demon child. The French theologian William of Auvergne was the first to describe the cambion, which he documented in his 13th century work De Universo. They are the children of demon incubi, substituted by female demons so that they are fed by them as if they are their own, as if swapped and substituted to female parents for their own children. They say that these are thin, always wailing, drinking so much milk that it takes 4 wet nurses to feed one. They are seen to stay with their wet nurses for many years, after which they fly away, or rather, vanish. Murgo, an invisible child who cries incessantly and is in the possession of a being that in English is called a wet nurse, and in its file name is called succubus, seems to be very similar to the description of a cambion. A nagging question remains. Why are the messengers the spirits of dead children? And why do we find them in the hunter's dream, and to a certain extent, within the nightmare as part of the Winter Lanterns and Crawlers? That's hard to say for certain, but we have a reasonable explanation. References to dead, deformed, or undead children are everywhere in Bloodborne. We also often see them referred to as orphans or illegitimate children. For example, we have the celestial children surrounding the orphanage of Upper Cathedral Ward. We have the gargoyle enemies of Cainhurst called Lost Children of Antiquity, whose name in the Japanese is closer to Ancient Bastard. We have the giant lost children in the Nightmare Frontier and the Nightmare of Mensis, whose name in the Japanese is closer to Giant who was abandoned as a child, as in an orphan. Then, of course, we have the ritual material called Bastard of Loran, the deformed remains of a child. Why would we see so many references to orphans and illegitimate children, especially when they're so often connected with dead children? My suspicion is that it comes back to the game's medical metaphor, which, as we've repeatedly documented on this channel, centers on anatomical dissection in Great Britain in the 1700s and 1800s. Dissecting the bodies of children and fetuses, although largely rebuked by the public, became common in the 19th century. This followed passage of the Anatomy Act of 1832, which broadened the categories of corpses that could be legally dissected by surgeons, which included the unclaimed bodies from hospitals, workhouses, and prisons. That made the remains of criminals, the mentally ill, and orphans fair game for anatomists. But unclaimed newborns and stillborn children were treasured in the medical community, as biological archaeologists Jenna Dittmar and Piers Mitchell documented in great detail. Fetal cadavers were valued for the study of growth and development, and were often kept in anatomical museums. The valuable and unique knowledge that could only be obtained from the examination of these developing bodies made them essential to the study of anatomy. Although these specimens were valuable, they were much easier to acquire in the mid-19th century than they were in prior generations. That's because days or weeks-old dead orphans, because they had no family to claim their bodies, were a class of corpse that could be legally dissected under the Anatomy Act. At the same time, mothers of illegitimate children also more commonly and willingly gave up their stillborn children for dissection for a modest payment from surgeons. Disturbingly, women in 19th century Great Britain increasingly forced themselves to miscarry or would kill their own newborns when the child was illegitimate. As Dittmar and Mitchell write, by the 1860s, the infanticide in England reached epidemic proportions. The coroner for Central Middlesex, Edwin Lancaster, estimated that over a several-year period in the mid-19th century, 12,000 women, or 1 in 30, had murdered their infants without detection in London. These miscarried and infant remains, increasingly from cases of infanticide, were regularly sold to anatomists. The School of Mensis, as we've repeatedly shown, is a depiction of these anatomists of the 17 and 1800s. Mensis scholars wear dark gowns that are reminiscent of those used in real-life dissections of the Victorian period. They send kidnappers to deliver fresh dead bodies in bags to Yahargul, just like the sack-em-up men or body snatchers in the employ of 18th and 19th century surgeons. They have lecture theaters like those of Victorian medical schools. And most critically for our present discussion, they have laboratories in which they experiment on what appear to be dead and not quite fully developed celestial children, presumably early attempts at birthing an infant great one. This begs the question, where did these malformed celestial children come from? If Ariana's birth to a celestial child is any indication, they were birthed by human women. But it appears that these experiments by the School of Mensis in the laboratories of the lecture building were unsuccessful, and these attempted celestial children didn't survive. The lecture building was pulled into the nightmare according to the lecture theater key, and it's how we access the nightmare frontier and the nightmare of Mensis, so it seems reasonable to assume that what took place in the lecture building was somehow responsible for creating some, if not most, of what we encounter in the nightmare. Perhaps these experiments were the origin of the winter lanterns, and why their heads are composed of messengers. They're the mothers, or maybe just representations of the mothers, who gave birth to these failed celestial children, and the dead messengers in their heads are the spirits of these dead infant celestial children. Admittedly, this is a guess on my part, and I don't have enough evidence to say that with a significant degree of confidence. That's one possible explanation for why these dead messengers are found in the nightmare. But why are the spirits of dead children found in the hunter's dream? Here, I think we have a bit more to go on. As we discussed in part 14 of my Agony of Effort series, the nightmares we encounter, the hunter's nightmare and the nightmare of Mensis, can be brought to an end. We appear to do this by atoning for past sins committed against Kaz and Queen Yarnum, two ghostly pale, powerful motherly figures whose dead bodies were defiled and their unborn children removed. Just as we do when we return the orphan's spirit to the sea and end the hunter's nightmare, when we defeat Murgo's wet nurse and allow Murgo's spirit to rest, we receive the nightmare slain text. Thus, we end the nightmares in the exact same way, by liberating the tortured spirits of dead infants. If we know, as Simon the Herod tells us, that the dissection of Kaz and the removal of her unborn child was the action that spawned the hunter's nightmare, it seems very, very reasonable to interpret that it was the same exact kind of sin that created the nightmare of Mensis, the dissection of a dead, pregnant woman and the removal of her unborn child, in this case, Queen Yarnum and Murgo. In both cases, we seem to be closing a circle by righting a past wrong, one perpetuated by the hunters and another by the Mensis scholars. But there's one final nightmare we can bring to an end. If we obtain and use 3 umbilical cords, we can summon and defeat the moon presence, giving us the nightmare slain message. The dreaming realms therefore end the same way, with a unique message. If we know that 2 of them began in the same fashion, with the dissection of a mother and her unborn child, then it seems highly likely that the hunter's dream has a similar origin story. In my previous projects, I've referred to the Hunter's Dream workshop as an anatomical study space. It's equipped with bone saws and jars for storing chemical solutions or preserving dissected tissues. The workshop desk is littered with syringes and sets of forceps used in surgery and dissection, not for metal casting and woodworking. This is a different kind of workshop. We also have the memory altar, which is covered in blood as if the dissection of a small body had taken place here. And let's not overlook the name of this feature. It's called the memory altar. Although an altar in Catholicism is the table upon which the sacrament is placed during communion, the term altar historically has been used to describe a platform upon which a ritual sacrifice is made in offerance to one or more gods. If a child was dissected on this altar in the waking world, it would make sense within the game's lore that this sacrifice is what brought forth the moon presence, a godlike great one. Also, it would certainly explain why we find one of the umbilical cords here within the abandoned workshop. It would make sense that this infant dissection in the abandoned workshop, presumably performed by Gehrman, was what spawned the Hunter's Dream, a near-carbon copy of the workshop as it appeared during Gehrman's earlier life. For years, I've operated on the assumption that the body Gehrman dissected in the abandoned workshop was a childlike version of the Orphan of Kos. Not the 9-foot-tall nightmare version from the fishing hamlet, but one of typical infant size. Perhaps that's true, but it's bothered me that freeing the spirit of the orphan has no impact whatsoever on the Hunter's Dream. Instead, it puts an end to the Hunter's nightmare. Perhaps there wasn't a unique named child that Gehrman dissected here, such as a Murgo or an Orphan of Kos. Perhaps it was many dead children, carving them up to harvest things like yellow backbones and inflicted organs so that they could be used as lures for great ones. That might sound strange considering how placid and verdant the Hunter's Dream and the abandoned workshop appear to be. But even beyond what we've observed about the anatomical nature of the workshop, there's other evidence that suggests this area isn't as unsullied as it would seem. Although it comes from cut dialogue and therefore should be viewed with a degree of skepticism, Gehrman doesn't refer to the Hunter's Dream workshop in endearing terms. Assuming he's referring to the workshop as it burns at the end of the game, Gehrman says,
"We've no need for this accursed abode. Let flame cleanse this house of horrors. Ah, these frightful things. Look at them burn."
If the workshop indeed was a house of horrors in which dissection of dead children occurred on a mass scale, then that might explain why the messengers, the spirits of stillborn children, are confined to the Hunter's Dream. Their spirits languish in this facsimile of the abandoned workshop here in the Dreamlands, a limbo of infants where they and Gehrman remain trapped for eternity. Thanks for watching.